Thank you so much, Cindy. Okay, our next presenter is Bryan King. You've got your lapel mic on, excellent. Bryan is an architect who has been exclusively designing animal shelters and other animal care facilities since 2002. He worked across the USA and Canada for 16 years before coming to Australia to join Therion as lead architect and design manager in 2018. Bryan has a broad understanding of the operational requirements of modern animal shelters and the challenges of caring for homeless animals in our communities. His goals for every project extend beyond satisfaction of the minimum standards or code of practice requirements, with an expectation to achieve designs that support currently accepted best practices for animal sheltering. Therion provides a comprehensive range of specialist architectural design services, including needs assessments with or without existing facility assessments, master planning, concept design, and detailed architectural design, inclusive of design project management, from pre-design through planning, approval, design, and construction. So welcome, Bryan King, presenting on the art and science approach to needs assessment and pre-design planning for animal shelter facilities.
Thank you.
That's forward.
Yes.
With the green, that's back, and that's the pointer.
Yep. Just that title alone is quite a mouthful. Thank you. So, trigger alert, I am going to be talking about maths. So I apologize for that right up front, but yeah, that's really what this is about today, is going through some numbers and calculations, and which is what I consider kind of the needs assessment, which is figuring out what actual capacity needs are. There's lots of different ways of evaluating capacity, and that's partially why the title of the presentation is the art and science. There's a little bit of science to it, which is the maths part that I'll be walking you through, but there is also some form of or amount of a leap of faith or interpretation of what the data is really telling you when you're trying to evaluate actual needs assessments. So right up front, I want to talk about a couple different types of needs assessments as well. So we worked with Cairns Regional Council going back to starting in early 2018, and I think it might have even extended into the end of 2017 when we started working through, in collaboration with Nell Thompson, the business case study is what we called it, kind of an operational study of what services made sense as they were looking at building a new animal management facility, and how those different services might guide their solution. So that report was completed in April of 2018, and then they went away and mulled over what the options were that were presented in that report. And then going forward to 2019, then we did a more detailed study on an actual animal capacity and program study. Now, they had already decided what services they wanted to offer. So that report then is what I refer to as a needs assessment with a functional brief. And what I mean by that, and you don't have to worry about all these numbers on the screen. Some of this is what I'll be walking through with you. But on the left side here, this table is the animal capacity studies. And it's based on how many animals they were actually managing in that council region, in the contributing area. And it's calculations of how many pens or enclosures they actually needed to accommodate. So that's one main part of what this needs assessment is trying to establish. The second part, which is what you see on the right here, is where we start looking at some actual architectural inputs. And this is what we refer to as, here it's called the building program, or this can be the functional brief. And what we have here is it's a listing of every single room that would go into a facility, a proposed facility, and the sizes of those rooms to come up with this is what size the facility needs to be. Now this is taking inputs, of course, from how many animals we need to have, as well as what operationally we determined through workshopping and collaboration with council on what services they wanted to offer. So some of the things that you would see in here are, there's of course public reception and public facing side of the facility, admin offices, so that's of course dependent on how many admin staff and people would be working in this facility. And then getting into medical areas, treatment spaces, surgical space and other type of treatment spaces, before we even get into what the actual animal holding capacity is and sizes. But all of these are driven by their operational needs, as well as then what the appropriate room sizes are. So the end, when I do a needs assessment, this is really what I see as the end goal. Figuring out how big is it, how many animals is it going to hold, and what's the bottom line. So in this case, we came up with an estimate of, it was just over 1,200 square meters of facility size is what they were going to need to accommodate the number of animals that we calculated were necessary. So moving beyond that, then that concept was translated into an actual concept plan, and these are the early concept design drawings, again from 2019, which you saw the needs assessment was only completed in August, but by December we had finalized a concept design that could then take the project to the next stage. All right, so now we're going to jump into some of the maths that I warned you about. So every consideration of shelter capacity really involves 3 different data points, I would call it. So there's the number of animals that you're dealing with, an average length of stay in days, and then the number of pens or enclosures. And a few notes about wording and whatnot. I will sometimes refer to these as pens or cages or kennels. I'm always talking about the same thing, which is one housing unit, okay? A unit that will, an enclosure that will handle one animal. So keep in mind that I'll use these interchangeably. And then also throughout this, I'll be talking about animals. It could be dogs, could be cats, could be rabbits, could be anything, and it's a matter of how you apply these same principles. Likewise, when I talk about animals and numbers of enclosures, it may be referring to an overall capacity, or it may be referring to a specific area, like adoption or isolation. And you have to correlate how many animals, whatever animal type it is going into that specific area. So if it's isolation or adoption or aggressive dogs or dangerous dogs, that type of thing, okay? You'll understand more as I get into this more. So still dealing with the science things, other metrics that you need to consider, of course, annual operating budget, and how much money do you have to spend to support the animals, a cost per animal, and what that cost per day of housing the animals is. And lastly, things that affect capacity. Peak demand. What do you do, it's less seasonal here, but kitten season, or when there is a disaster and you need disaster response. How does that affect your peak demand? If you have a welfare case and a large number of animals needs to come into the facility, how do you consider that peak demand? Here we're talking about the art because you don't always know what life's going to bring you. So the next thing is considering demographics. What is going to be changing in your community? Because we're trying to forecast into the future when we're doing a needs assessment. How many more people and animals are you going to need to serve? And I always look at it as a direct correlation between human population and the animal population. Now, that can change based on changing legislation or even policies. You know, how will future policies or legislation in your community change that could affect your needs for sheltering? Okay? So the questions we're going to try to answer as quickly as possible is, first of all, how many pens do we need? Next question that a lot of people ask is, how many animals can we handle based on our current number of pens? What is a reasonable amount that we should be able to handle? And then lastly, kind of, what's the cost per day for housing animals? Okay. The first question, if there's one thing that you take away from this today, this is really the one that I want you to try to get. Okay. There's a lot of consideration for capacity for care and how how many animals you can manage to care for with the resources you have. What I'm talking about here is really just the infrastructure, the facility. How many pens do you need based on how many animals you're trying to care for in your facility? Okay, so when we look at this, the number of pens that you need can be calculated based on the total number of animals per year divided by how many days there are in a year. And this gives you basically how many animals per day you're dealing with, and then multiply that by an average length of stay. Okay, this is science. This is just basic math. How many animals per day do you have to deal with, and how many days are you going to care for that animal in whatever that specific situation is that they're going into? All right, so to come up with, first of all, that question, which is number of animals per year, we always look at 3 to 5 years of data and try to come up with an average of how many animals a shelter or a community pound is taken care of. Now, this is a little bit where we go back to the art of dealing with this, and you have to interpret what this data means. First challenge is actually getting this data. Not everybody has good statistics and data on intakes and outcomes. But assuming that they do, this is an example from an actual client project that we did a needs assessment for. First thing you'll notice, so this starts with 2017-18 and comes up to 2021-22. And the top part of this table is all intake. So I've highlighted there total intake, and the top part is all categorized by dogs and puppies for each year. And what you see here, if you can read it, is back in the beginning, we were dealing with almost 5,400 total dogs a year. And then through the wonderful pandemic years, we saw annual intake drop down to about 3,000 and then even below 3,000. Placing an average of 4,100 dogs per year were coming into this facility. So the first art exercise is figuring out, well, what does that mean? You know, what is this, as an organization, what do you think is going to happen? Are you okay dealing with 4,100? Do you think that's realistic? moving forward? Are you going to return, or are you going to get back up to 5,400? And sometimes you have to, take a little bit of a leap of faith and decide what number you're going to use. But in this case, we just kind of moved on with the 4,100, and then, then the next line is the bottom part of this table is the outcomes. So I like to look at adoptions and rehoming capacity, and I'll explain why in a second here. All right, so example of that formula that I showed you on calculating the number of pens. So there's that 4,108 dogs per year divided by 365 days a year. And if you set an aspirational average length of stay as 14 days, you can calculate that you need 158 pens for dogs in this example. So keeping in mind that this 14 days is for every single animal that comes in, or every single dog in this instance, okay? Maybe too long, maybe too short. But that's where we have to have discussions around what is a reasonable number to account for. And then the same calculation for cats. Now what we also do is we try to break it out. So in this case, in this example, we've allowed for 14 days length of stay for every dog and 20 days for cats to arrive at kind of these numbers of 158, again, for every animal coming in. We can look at it then, the table on the right here is starting to break down the same, it does the same calculations, but allows for an impound area, which is really just the arriving animals for all animals coming into the shelter, of only 7 days for each, because after 7 days, they're going to move on. Then a separate 28 days average for adoption area. And that applies only to the number of animals that are being adopted. So you see 982 here for dogs instead of the 4,100. So if you're adopting out 982 dogs, but they're going to be held in adoption areas for 28 days, that's different math, okay? But in the end, what it gets to is the same, roughly the same answer, okay? So that's the basics, which is take the number of animals that you have divided by the 365 days a year times a length of stay. All right. The next thing that affects your capacity is going to be the two things I mentioned, which is peak demand and future growth. Using the numbers that you calculate from what I would consider the minimum capacity that's needed based on your historical data, then you need to forecast into the future. What do I want to allow for peak demand? What do I want to allow for future growth? And these are cumulative. These are additive. So you go from 158 calculated up to 190 if you applied 20% peak demand. Pick a number. And then future growth is really just based on what your demographic forecast population growth is for a period of time. 20 years, 15 years, 30 years, whatever it is, what do you think you're going to see? Okay. How many animals then? So some facilities just go, well, I've got 20 pens. How many animals should I be able to care for? It's taking the same formula, the same 3 data points, and working it differently. So the number of pens you have times the number of days per year divided by that average length of stay that you're going to deal with, okay? So I call this calculation, this top line here, the result of that, the dog days. How many dog days capacity do you have? Well, if you've got 20 pens at 365 days a year, you've got 7,300 dog days. You've got 7,300 dog days worth of capacity in your facility. If you divide that by how long each dog's going to be in there, that tells you that a facility with 20 pens should be able to handle 521 dogs a year if they were all there for 14 days. All right, I've gone far over on explaining those maths, so a few quick little things here. Average length of stay works the same way. To come up with the length of stay, number of pens times the 365 days per year divided by the number of animals. This is important because some facilities are overbuilt. And if you have too many pens, then, and you don't really have the number of animals, that's going to tell you that your length of stay is far over, all right? Here's an example working it the other way. Average cost per day is a factor of your annual expenses divided by the number of pens, assuming that you are at capacity all the time. And the other way of looking at it is to first come up with the cost per animal and then divide by the length of stay. Those are those examples. So to wrap up, really the part of the point I want to make is that more is not always better. You want to start with figuring out what your calculated capacity or your need really is. Building more than you need is going to increase your build cost. It's going to increase your length of stay because everybody goes to full capacity. And then that, in turn, does increase the cost per animal. So anyway, do the maths. We can help you with it if needed. Thank you. Thank you.